Hello and welcome to the King Heroes Journey podcast. My name is Beth Martins, and I have the huge pleasure of interviewing Miguel Conner today for the fifth time on the King Heroes Journey over the years that we've known each other pre-pandemic, actually. Our connection goes back. Many of the truther folks got related via the pandemic, but we were early adopters of the pandemic, I think, Miguel. So I'm going to, without further ado, bring him on and we'll get started. Hello, Miguel. Welcome.
Thanks for having me on. Yeah, 5 times. I think you've been on my podcast 3 or 4 times, but I'll have to check again. Time, like you probably agree, time has kind of lost its meaning since 2020.
Yeah, that's actually a really good.
We knew it wasn't linear by our, religious experiences, but now our conscious mind is starting to believe it.
Yeah, exactly. I know, what a mess. It really takes a lot of work these days to keep your wits about you. And it's actually brought up some of the traumas, like working through what is technically an easier time now, but working through some of the traumas of what we had been through and the terror and the abuse and the craziness and madness. It kind of keeps going in Canada, where we don't have a real break from that. We just elected our Liberal government for it'll be the fourth, what do they call it, thing in a row, term in a row. And this country is just going to hell really fast. Unfortunately, kind of sad. Yeah, look, checking out some escape routes, but welcome to everybody who's coming in. Do say hello in the chat, and if there's any questions as we go along, I'll no doubt be able to get to them. We're going to be talking about Elvis today and the archetypes of the occulted Elvis, which I could have never dreamt up that title, but it is part of the title of Miguel's new book. He is the author of other books, Voices of Gnosticism, Stargazer, Heretic, and The Executioner's Daughter. He lives in northern Illinois. I just saw a funny meme about Illinois that said, welcome to Illinois. Stop and think about what you did wrong to get here.
So true. So true. Yeah. Illinois is right behind Canada, right off the cliff very soon. So what are you going to do? Go out to nature and take care of your own, go inward. That's it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's kind of an ongoing theme about escape. I've been trying to get out for my whole life, and a near-death experience taught me that there's no out. Even death is not an out. And that kind of goes along with some Gnostic thinking that you've done extremely deep dives on, especially in your podcast, Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio, where I have also been a guest at least 3 times. We were thinking maybe 4. And so that's been, it's a really juicy podcast. If you're not familiar with it, then you're going to go in and you could say Miguel has no boundaries, but it's not really like that in that respect, that you have extremely open mind to all kinds of high strangeness. And then we had a phrase come up from David Bowie, the strange fascination that can be created around all of that work. So, yeah, go ahead.
No, for sure. Yeah, and I started a podcast also called Gen X Wasteland to talk about more culture, music, Elvis, Bowie, and all that stuff. And I think that's the key, because in our generation, remember a time long ago when we could all have dialogue, even if it was heated. Censorship was sort of the left and the right hated it. It was a different generation, and our generation warned people that if things are going to go bad if we stop rebelling for 1 second, and here we are.
And here we are, exactly. And they even weaponized the rebel side of that against us as well. I noticed it became really clear the last couple of years how they've got us looping between the child and the rebel, because some of the child archetype can, put their head up above the covers and go like, holy crap, what's going on? And get mad about it. And then they get stuck in that dynamic, and it shoots them back into not caring, which is the denial of the child. So that's where a lot of people find themselves on those loops these days. That's one of my missions, to help people keep going on the journey and get off that map ultimately altogether. So again, if you're not familiar with Miguel's work, you can get started at his website. I'm going to put a link in the chat so that it's clickable, hopefully. With any luck, that'll work. And you can visit him at Aeon Byte on Facebook and Instagram, same handle. on X as well. And then his YouTube channel is Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started unless there's anything else you wanted to say. No.
You got it covered. You
Okay.
got it covered.
Okay, very good. All right, and let me see, where's my notes? Get them ducks in a row here. So what was the moment that you knew that you were so interested? Because to write a book, it's not a little thing. And I could imagine writing, 100 books, but I can also imagine with those topics, so with those 100 topics, keep me going right through the whole process of writing, which from what you're saying and what we talked about earlier has got easier for you. But what was it that made you so fascinated that you knew you could go the distance with this one?
I don't think I had much of a choice. I think it was a pull. It was almost like an autonomous voice, not actually a vision, but a voice. I mean, for a little backdrop, all my life I was, as they say, a Beatles person. I never had any like or caring for Elvis Presley. I thought he was, as I've said, or as I say in the book, he was the pop music version of McDonald's or Mountain Dew or something like that. And so he never meant much to me. As I got older, start reading history, I appreciate his impact on our culture and music and so forth. But it really was almost a bunch of synchronicities and strange encounters and doing plant medicine in the summer of 2022 that this voice came out of nowhere saying, I am Elvis. And there's a story that is out there, but people have ignored it. And there's a dimension of my life that needs to be addressed. And this voice was very powerful. It was an urge. It was a gut. It was an obsession. All of a sudden, I couldn't get Elvis out of my life. I was listening to all his music, watching documentaries, dressed up as Elvis for Halloween. I don't dress up for Halloween. And it was a possession, or as I often say, I became quantum entangled with Elvis. Some people might say I became channeled. So eventually this was so overwhelming and powerful. I knew if I don't do this, as we often find out, it's, sometimes the divine God, the spirits, your soul, they give you two choices: do what we want, or there's going to be a lot of pain on the other side. And I'm wise enough where I said, I'm just going to do it. And I sat down on February of 2023, cold winter day, with only one bio of Elvis, didn't know much about him still. And I started writing this book, and this book just flowed out of me. Within 3 months, I had the first draft of this story that hadn't been told to the general public, or more like it was out there, but had been suppressed because I didn't, as you know, Elvis used to be the conspiracy theory before conspiracy theories. Remember the tabloids and the documentaries when we were young? I mean, he was, UFO Elvis and Elvis this, and did he survive? And was he connected to the mob and all this stuff? And my book, I went directly to all the information that was out there from lauded and reliable sources: Priscilla, the Memphis Mafia, spiritual teachers, friends, family that had seen and experienced this metaphysical, supernatural part of Elvis. And they put it in all these bios that have been cross-referenced and checked and all that. And I just started to collate them and offer different angles to understand the rise and fall of Elvis Presley and how it relates to our era today.
Oh, beautifully encapsulated. I love that. Nicely done. And so suppression, right? That's the name of, you might call it our era, but really, did that era start even in our lifetime? We're talking about the 1950s and then 60s and 70s of his lifetime. I remember for me growing up, anything related to Elvis came with some kind of controversy, some kind of drama, some kind of, seeing the transformation, how bad his body responded to everything, like going from just like this hunk of a man with a lot of very, very masculine energy. And then, just like kind of blobbing out and getting overweight, getting out of control, and then he's dead. And and that's an interesting thing you said also about there was it maybe a manufactured dichotomy between Elvis and the Beatles? Like they wanted you to go one or the other?
Yeah, I would say that the Beatles probably copied Elvis. Elvis was so unique, and it was this just nuclear explosion that came out of nowhere in the 50s, and it caught everybody off guard, and he rearranged so much of our cultural landscape forever in so many different ways, and we can talk about those if you want, but everything changes. John Lennon himself said before Elvis, there was nothing. It's almost like a new consciousness exploded and woke up people, and it made a lot of people angry. We must remember, as much as he was loved when he came out, he was so hated by the powers that be, the status quo, churches, government, and all that. So he was this massive explosion that history had never seen before, and certainly not American history or Western history. And even people like David Lynch and others have said he was the greatest cultural icon of the 20th century and really represented the post-war world that we found ourselves in it. And he symbolized it, and he, in a way, helped us navigate it. So he set the stage, as I write in my book. He, in the early 60s, because of his interests in spirituality and Hinduism and martial arts and multicultural music and so many other things, he was seeding this, which really laid the stage for the 60s. I mean, he was going to Yogananda's ashram years before George Harrison started going there. So he was certainly the foundation for so much culture. And unfortunately, I think the Beatles kind of knew and copied it. I mean, because we have to remember the Beatles didn't just explode like Elvis. They were popular in England, but a lot of it had to be manufactured here in the United States. Like, the girls losing their minds, that was completely automatic or out of nowhere with Elvis. But with the Beatles, I'm finding out these women were planted in their audience because they knew. And other things too, like when Elvis came out, the sort of androgynous, beautiful male, the Adonis type archetype, really had not been seen before, right? It was Gary Cooper and all, Frank Sinatra, these chiseled, manly men, and Elvis sort of redesigned what it was to be a full man. You could be, again, vulnerable, but still so strong. And people like the Beatles and the Stones started copying this sort of androgynous look and so much more. And I've done research with other people like Steven Snyder, and I can tell you that there is no social engineering or CIA behind Elvis. I've looked and I've looked. The usual suspects are not there, Beth.
Right, you're reading my mind exactly, because anything that explodes into the culture. Now, it was at least before the day of being able to easily explode things into culture. They didn't have the internet. Everything was like slowly typing on the typewriter and all of those kind of things. So it does stand a chance at being more organic. And every engineered movement also has an organic element to it, where either the organic was happening and then it gets co-opted, or the other way around, that it's pushed and then the people make it something that wasn't expected. Do you think either of those is possible in this case?
It is possible. I mean, again, with Elvis, it's almost like he symbolizes and manufactured the culture, because
Mhm.
remember, he was the first really multi media kind of artist. He went and he conquered TV. TV was there, but it was kind of this black and white, ha ha ha, goofy stuff. He went in and said, "No, I'm making this mine, and I'm going to show everybody what power, what sexuality, what's is." And then he did that with the jukebox, with the live concerts, with anything he could get his hands on. With technology, he really mastered. A lot of it was because of his connection with Colonel Parker. Then you can say, well, Colonel Parker might have been connected to the mob, but it didn't matter, because in something that hasn't changed is that record companies are corrupt. They're always connected to the mob. They will destroy your soul and spit you out. And Colonel Parker was sort of this, mafioso that could protect Elvis from the dark side, while they both sort of appropriated culture, other music, and just took it into this massive explosion and movement.
Amazing. Yeah, really good. Good to know that the record companies are that you found that their corruption is pretty consistent over the years. They haven't.
Yeah, like Hollywood, no different. They're just the music side of Hollywood, just basically Babylon evil. And that hasn't changed. Elvis hated Hollywood. He said there's just a bunch of phonies, godless fools. His mother hated it. But of course, he took their millions of dollars too. He was not stupid.
Right, exactly. Well, I always have that attitude that I don't mind using the enemy's resources against them. There's nothing wrong with that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. And so, were there things in Elvis's early life that pointed towards the mysticism, towards, the? I mean, you have so many angles. Actually, let's start by outlining some of the archetypes that you do see in Elvis. You mentioned Adonis, the full man, the strong man. I'm not sure how that plays in with the androgynous look, or is that related
I
to
think it
Adonis?
is. I mean, yeah, because Adonis is still this beautiful man who's ultimately subservient to the goddess, and you have many examples of this. And Elvis, despite his machismo, was always subservient to his mother, and in many ways he was to Priscilla and other things. So it is there. I offer my ideas, but I do offer other writers. My book presents a lot of prisms and angles for the reader to see Elvis, from the mundane, like today's psychology, to very woo-woo, like ufology, that he could have been and I bring in Jung and Steiner and alchemy, so people can see for themselves the different prisms of Elvis and find what works for them. Even the archetypal, because, for example, Chris Knowles, who I bring his research, he sees him as Apollo. He's a sun god, a Polonian musician, and all that. And others see him as a Orpheus, the singer, the tortured singer, sensitive singer who dies. And I bring in a Jungian who sees him more as the king archetype. I mean, obviously, right? The king. And he says he was the embodiment of the king. He was the image of the archetype of the king for America, for Western culture. But this Jungian says the problem is that you have to be careful, because archetypes can invade you. And if you let them invade you, ultimately they will consume you, because that's their job, to be manifest in the most obvious way. And Elvis let the king archetype take over him, just like Marilyn Monroe let the queen or the princess archetype take over her. And we know what happened. These energies are so powerful, they will consume you and you can't handle them. So, I mean, of course, my personal one is obviously the trickster archetype. And I make the argument that Elvis was closer to the trickster archetype because he appeared at the changing of an age, and the trickster is an artist. The trickster is somebody who challenges you to change, who rearranges your life in ways you couldn't believe, like Elvis did, and so forth. So I let the reader decide, and I don't make any hard stances myself.
You can't make hard stances where archetypes are concerned, because you're never going to stop seeing them through your own archetypal lenses.
Right.
And it's one of the beauties when I train coaches. I've got an advanced group that we play, an archetype game where I bring memes or images or quotes, and then we read the archetypes that are there. And I always have an idea of, like, there's the king and there's the alchemist and this kind of thing. And then they come in and they see something completely different that I missed entirely. But when they say it, it's like, oh yeah, it is there. So yeah, it's never a right and wrong when it comes to the archetypes. I like so much how the identification of the king being like that was his brand almost, right? Like that was his persona.
We all know him, yeah.
Right,
King of
exactly.
rock and roll.
Yeah, it was in fact fun to make the thumbnail for this, because it's the king hero's journey, and it's just a perfect fit for Elvis, right?
Right.
And in my system of the hero's journey that I write about in my book, the king and the alchemist are right next to each other. I'm starting to unpack all of these sub archetypes within those very big categories, and that's gonna like balloon out probably another 20 years before I really fully write on that. But the trickster in my system is under the alchemist, and the alchemist is directly after the king, right? So there's a strong relationship between those two.
And that would fit Elvis too, because yes, when he came out, he's one of those rare figures in history where he's the greatest while he's still just getting started. You know, he was already dubbed the king of rock and roll, just like, you know, Wayne Gretzky was already the greatest hockey player in the middle of his career, or Michael Jordan. You know what I mean? There are certain people that transcend history, and they've already written history while they're still in the middle of their history. So he was already the king. But later, as I write in the book, in the 60s, when he became disillusioned with his life, with fame, with money, you know, he wasn't getting all the answers, the metaphysical answers that he was seeking from church and other places. That's when he got into the occult. That's when he started just throwing all these systems like Theosophy, Yogananda, Gnostic Gospels, Greek Orthodoxy, and to this wonderful pile of weirdness, and practicing meditation while incorporating prayer. And yeah, he really in the 60s became this huge alchemist, if you would. And in the 70s, suddenly he transforms into Vegas Elvis. When you look, it's so obvious it's occult and mystic. When you look at his shows and his outfits with the Egyptian and Aztec motifs and all that, you realize, oh my God, he wasn't singing about it, but he really incorporated. And that's when he turns into this, you would say, trickster or shaman. Again, he's bringing these energies without telling anybody, but he's there with his tribe in Vegas and the Houston Astrodome, and really connecting in these very mystical rituals and so forth. So yeah, it would definitely fit your system.
There you go. Yeah, and I wanted to just quickly go back and talk about the one archetype you mentioned around. Well, actually, it's back to the king. We're still on the king subject, and how incredibly offensive that would have been to Christianity, because right, Jesus is the king and the only king, and so that I'm imagining was a huge insult to all of that community.
Well, yeah. I mean, he was burned because when he came out, especially Protestants, evangelicals turned on him big time. They were furious because he was he was awakening things in people that they hadn't felt. Remember, the word teenager didn't even exist until Elvis came out. He created this whole new case of people that followed him. And these people were like, finally, the one time in history, they were rebelling big time against the older generation. They're like, you know, gee, thanks. Yeah, we're out of World War II and the Great Depression. Now we got nuclear bombs and Soviets and UFOs. It's like, we have a lot of money, but this world in many ways was more dangerous than the other world. We got Stalin running around, you know? So they rebelled and like, we want to explore new spirituality. We want to explore new types of music, Black and Hispanic, you know, the way men and women work together. We want to shift things around and explore more of these things. I mean, media, we want to use more technology. It's just not for the government. We want it more for the people. So he changed that around. And because of his, shaking his hips and things that people had never done before, it made people angry. His own pastor said he was running with Satan. Billy Graham, the great evangelical exemplar, denounced him. So he got really mad. And he also, on his own, even when he was a teenager, he came to a conclusion that eternal damnation made no sense. Reincarnation was just a more logical, theological stance. He didn't like this, stern God that they were teaching at the churches. And so he started exploring a Jesus that fit his idea, more cosmic Jesus, a more self-realized guru type Jesus. But he was still, I mean, that's the thing about Elvis, is that people would come to him at concerts and always say, "Oh, you are the king." And Elvis always said, "No, honey, there are only one king, and that's Jesus Christ." Of course, in his mind, his Jesus was probably a little different than your average fan. And Elvis would have been fine, you know, find you the Christ within you and you run with it.
There you go. Yeah, and that's speaking to a whole lot of rebel energy right there as well, being willing to even allow yourself to be called the king. Because I don't know, sometimes those messages you really can't control how the public paints you.
Yeah,
But
they used to call him Pelvis, and he hated that. That was one
okay.
thing
Oh, I never
he
heard that
couldn't control that. Yeah, they called him the Pelvis.
Funny. Yeah, I didn't know that about inventing the teenager. The whole invention of even childhood didn't exist at a time. That was a manufactured kind of idea where
Mhm.
you had these stages of development. So yeah, that's fascinating. I love that. Um, let's see, where do we go from here? Around what were the early signs in Elvis's life of moving towards any of this, especially the mysticism and the very deep changing of culture? Do you think there's
Oh, yeah.
all the lead up signs?
Yeah, it's almost like Elvis had no choice but to be Elvis. Just like I had no choice but to write this book. And that's one of the themes you see throughout the book is fate versus destiny. Can we really break fate? Can we not break fate? And can we make a destiny at least out of whatever fate we have and march to our doom at least with something that we can give others? Jokingly aside, I always say Elvis was the original Oedipus because Oedipus was a king. Oedipus was a rock star. He tricked the Sphinx and everything else. So he was a musician, and he had a weird relationship with his mother, which Elvis also had. Elvis was too much of a mama's boy. But the whole idea of fate from the beginning, Beth, when Elvis lost his brother, his twin, right there.
Right.
Jesse came out 35 minutes later. And as people have finally caught up in psychology, is extremely destructive. I mean, yeah, we know that twins are connected and the loss is devastating. But as a child, even as a baby, it is devastating. Twins play in the womb. They communicate in the womb. And when you lose a twin, it's called, you become a twinless survivor, which is a psychological trauma where you have survivor's guilt. You are always asking the big questions in life, like Elvis would be like, how come we had the same birth, but Jesse died and I did not? Why was I born poor and then I became a millionaire, when if we'd had money at the beginning, we could have had the baby at the hospital instead of our little shack in the Great Depression without a doctor. Jesse would have survived. You know, these twinless survivors are seekers. They are very artistic. They are very metaphysical, but on the shadow side, they are very self-destructive, prone to addiction. They have a hard time connecting to the opposite sex. And I give other examples: Liberace, twinless survivor; Philip K. Dick, twinless. You see this pattern in these individuals, which is very tragic, because they die early, a lot of them. It's just the way it is. And so right there, from before he came out of the womb, it was set. And then I talk about how Vernon went out to have a cigarette, Elvis's father, on January 8th, and this blue light came over the house. And I said, well, is this like an alien craft or one of those herald stars like you have with Jesus and Alexander the Great and Buddha, whatever it was? But Vernon freaked out because suddenly the light covered the area. All the wind stopped. All the nocturnal animals like coyotes went silent, and he like freaked out and went inside the house, only to see his son pass away. And even before, there were two dolls on a shelf, and as Gladys, Elvis's mother, is having going in labor, one of the dolls shakes and falls and breaks. So one of the dolls had to survive. So all these things off the bat really shaped Elvis's life. And then even worse, when Gladys went to the hospital later, the doctor said she would not be able to conceive. So she became very possessive. I mean, it's almost naturally, right? I mean, she's traumatized, but she became so possessive, she really destroyed Elvis's psyche, is what you call the lethal enmeshment, when the mother makes the son the proxy husband and won't allow him to get healthy ego boundaries and explore, and this child becomes this extreme of the head of the household, but this little sneaky child so he can escape his mother. And this becomes also a psychological issue with these people, because again, they can't well, they're in a lot of pain, and they tend to be, yes, prone to addiction, have problem making connections with other women. They're self-destructive, workaholics, but they're very driven. So as you can see, and there's a lot more, Beth, but as you can see, Elvis had no choice but to be Elvis, as a star, as a self-destructive person, but as a mystic, because Gladys did give him a good gift, which was second sight. She had mystical abilities, and she passed them on to Elvis. They both could astral travel at will. They could do faith healing. They could see the veil of reality and see shadow people. They had visions and voices in their head. But Gladys always told Elvis, don't tell anybody or we'll get around these areas. And she used to beat him if he even tried to talk about his mystic abilities. But again, with trying to figure out why Jesse died, the mystical abilities, everything else, Elvis had no choice but to be Elvis the rock star and Elvis the seeker.
Great points. Yeah, so fascinating with the relationship with the mom. I did a deep dive on the nurturer archetype last year. And one of the things I was aware of from my own experiences of recounting my own birth, which was not easy to do because there's no data. I was born of a twilight birth. My mom had zero memory of it. She couldn't tell me. I was trying to get some data for my own birthing of my own son. And she's like, well, who knew? I don't know. I wasn't present. And so I was unpacking that on a few people's tables, and I'm still on a few people's tables unpacking that experience, having visceral memories of coming to the birth space, which is really, it should be a life space, but it was a death space. Coming and I've had this a few times. It's very confirmed in my own consciousness that my mom was dead or dying in my birth. Because the drugs, if they give you a little more, you would die. It's not right. It's a lot right along that spectrum of death. And hello to people who are coming in the chat, Rose and Conspiracy Music Guru. Really fun to have you here, and Anne and Candace.
And that was actually, interesting. And sorry for the interruption.
That's okay. Go ahead.
That was one of his rituals that he did. He had a lot of rituals, but Elvis would sit alone, and this is in the 70s, in his room. He'd light a candle and he'd stare at the candle, and he could make himself go back in time all the way to his birth and all the way into the womb. It was one of his solace, try to find answer rituals.
Amazing. Yeah. So good. And I'll just finish the conclusion that I came to around that, or one of them anyway. I'm sure there's multiple, but it's that when the caregiver isn't there, and it's the same for Elvis, because as you very poignantly wrote about in that excerpt that I read, how the birth of the son was there, but then it was actually the tragedy of the stillbirth, and then the mom is in incredible distress. She's you can't think of a bigger distress for a mother, and it's already distressing. Normal birth is already distressing. So to be coming into the world to a caregiver that was in trouble like that, I'd have to also guess that there was some kind of, when you talk about maybe, the mama's boy and a little bit of collusion around these mystical powers. I also have a strong belief the mystical powers come up through injury, whether it's physical or psychic, or they're highly correlated. They come as a pair often. And then that nurturer archetype where the baby decides, oh, I have to look after my mom. My mom's not going to make it, therefore I'm not going to make it. So did you come across that nurture as well?
Yeah, for sure. God, yeah, I can't imagine you have a child who's not alive and she had to wait 35 minutes of pushing, and that 35 minutes of pure living hell. I can't even imagine what you went through.
No.
But that I think I relate that in the book to the idea of the wounded healer, because another lens I put is Elvis the shaman. And when you look at the characteristics of a shaman, Elvis fits them all the time, from the spiritual troubleshooter of the tribe, the healer of the tribe, the one who goes into the spiritual world for ideas to help the tribe. I make the argument that rock music was never a form of entertainment. It was a spiritual modality, a sound vibration of blues and gospel music that were put together by these individuals who were in pain in the South, from Johnny Cash to Elvis to Jerry Lee Lewis to Little Richard. And when you see him in concert in Vegas, you go, this is a shaman. And shamans are about theatrics and costumes and music. Essential for a shaman to use music with the tribe. And they are therapists of both men and women. But across, again, Elvis fits the shaman. It's in the book. But across the world, there's the idea of a wounded healer. In other words, the shaman is chosen because he is broken. He is traumatized, permanently traumatized. And this trauma has broken the channels of communication open to the spirit world. Obviously, CIA, MK Ultra figured that out. That's why they torture these kids so they can find gateways to higher worlds that they can loot or do whatever they do. But the tribes, tribes have known this for tens of thousands of years. And this child, because of a near-death experience or a handicap or something like that, has the power to look to the spirit world, and they are chosen as the shaman. But they have to be traumatized. And this wounded healer comes to believe that I can heal you and understand you, not despite my wounds, but because of my wounds. That, in fact, if I lose my wounds, my trauma, then I can't heal you or understand you. So it's this great self-sacrifice of me to be in pain and to slowly self-destruct so that I could help the rest of the trauma. It's very savior-like, messianic. I mean, many have compared Jesus to the wounded healer trope, but that's how it is. And I think that Elvis fits that too. And we know whether it's Jim Morrison or others, that they want their empathy, their idea of self-sacrifice is almost what gives them their power, their magic, their artistic bent, and so forth. So, and in some cultures, Beth, the shaman does end up being a drug addict and a broken down person, because the responsibility of carrying the tribe, the trauma, we both know that trauma doesn't heal. One of the biggest lies somebody ever told me is time heals all wounds. And I'm like, no, wounds are timeless. They don't deal with time and space. They are forever there. But the shaman uses that as their power, if you know what I mean. And again, that explains Elvis in many ways from the beginning to the end.
Nice. That's beautiful. Yeah. That's, I'm going to definitely include the wounded healer in the nurturer archetype, because it comes through their own injuries, but also the injuries to their caregivers. That's something that I'm really super tuned in with, because there's so many disabled caregivers, and they've made it so, right? The average hospital birth does harm and disable that mother, and it kills their nurturer right out of the gate, which is tragic for everybody involved. Just before we go on, was there any evidence of family sacrifice? I'm not sure exactly where Alex is coming from here.
Families, I don't know.
You want to clarify?
There's nothing. I mean, it was just these very poor people, Pentecostals, sharecroppers, bootleggers, the Presleys, having a child in the shack without indoor plumbing, and then, just the birth went wrong. That's all there is to it. And that's it. I mean, of course. So I don't see anything. If that's what he's talking about, I don't see anything like that.
Right. Yeah, I'm not totally sure. Feel free to.
Yeah, there were the Presleys were nobody. They were like, you have to understand, in the Great Depression in the in the South, when you research it, the conditions were, you don't see that in North Korea. It was really a forgotten part of this country. And it was the blacks, the whites, the natives. Just the South was just this wasteland of very hungry and very traumatized people who were trying to exist day to day. Some nights, all Elvis had was water and cornbread. That was his life as a child, and there was nothing. So no Christmas, no birthdays, just this this terrible existence, which of course, again, added to him because that gave him the drive to really work hard to get him where he needed to go. But he still couldn't understand how could there be this poverty in the world.
Right. And when you talk about the malnourishment going on there, and how I've done a deep dive into the liver these last kind of my whole adult life in some ways, but much deeper in the last few years. And then, one of the main causes of liver damage is malnourishment. And we have inherited the weaknesses coming up, but all of our ancestors, like my grandparents, also lived through the Depression. And I remember, you heard all those stories, like Christmas would come and we would get an orange, and that was like a wow, like a whole kind of call it Christmas. And so the effect of that malnourishment in that mother, right, being it's part of the incredibly impoverished, and then the child growing and trying to live and develop on that thing, and then the connection of madness and the liver. This is something now that I'm really, really interested and fascinated by, because when the liver goes down, so does the the mental, the emotional, and the spiritual side of that being also goes dark. I've witnessed it firsthand in people around me that were dying, and as the liver became more and more damaged, when you thought it couldn't take any more damage, then madness set in to the next level. And the whole world of mental health, like you say, that the shaman and the mentally ill, they're pretty. There's a pretty good blur between there, and then the shaman themselves may never heal. I don't think that there's some will argue that you cannot heal certain kinds of damage. If the tree is split, maybe if we go to some James True, which I haven't been in contact with him for a long time, but he said absolutely no, trauma cannot be healed. It's like lightning hit the tree split like this, and the tree is never going to come back together. But you could also just redefine healing in that you're, what do you make of it? What do you create out of it? Do you make it a positive force for other people who maybe, because of your experience, don't have to suffer so immeasurably or so long like you did, however you turn and flip that? But yeah, and at some point, I definitely want to talk about all the pharmaceuticals that Elvis ended up on, because that's foreshadowing a series that I'm going to be creating. But go ahead. Yeah,
for sure. I mean, as you were saying, and as research has shown us, poverty is traumatizing. And then what our ancestors went through, insanity, hunger, all that, is epigenetic. In other words, which is no secret, right? Beth, the natives and other cultures have known this for years. It makes the job harder, because we got to work out our trauma, our karma, and like, God damn, I got to work out my ancestors too, because they're screaming. They're like, either we all heal or we all get on board, or or it's going to get worse as it gets down. So that's an issue too. But as far as the trauma, I agree, but you can alchemize it and you can use it for your own benefit. For example, as a recovering addict, if I help somebody else stay sober, the feeling is so powerful, it makes the trauma worth it. It's like, ooh, and it makes me, in a way, more balanced and healthier, helping others and healing others before they do damage, or helping them cope with the damage. So I would say certainly on that too. So it's a hard task, but what are you going to do?
Yeah, it's a very stark calling, right? That's it's heal or go into the abyss of insanity,
Right.
Physical and mental, right? So yeah, and sometimes that kind of polarity is amazing for us, because it makes it gives you that, I've been in that do or die, where, like, which is it going to be? And that can push you into that place of decisiveness. And yeah, the sins of our forefathers, we call it epigenetic inheritance at this point, and that can have a very positive effect where you heal and you pass on good qualities. But yeah, I'm well aware of how our ancestors in some ways got away with more, and in some ways were also just more suppressed, because like you said, that was literally not allowed. Elvis would get punished if he was to speak any of the things that he was hearing inside himself. Like now, when you say hearing voices, that's going to, if you say that in the wrong circles, that's going to get you on really dangerous drugs. The most dangerous of all the psych drugs is when you're hearing voices. So, and the degree to which pharmakia has been capitalizing on this, if not actually creating this, and, knowing about the madness, knowing about the malnutrition, knowing about the poisoning, and then is slowly sending humanity as a whole over the deep end. But the spirit being so much more powerful, it's always going to have that choice and maybe take the choice to go into the more wounded healer side of things.
Yeah, and that's one of the issues I bring up with Elvis and also Philip K. Dick is the tragedy of sometimes we are simply blinded by our generation and our culture. I mean, and of course, you try to wake up, but you got to keep doing it. For example, many people are going, oh my God, Elvis, what are you talking about? A spiritual side? It's like, what do you expect? That's what we do. The red pills never stop. Nothing, the official story is never going to stop, whether it's Elvis or people you are so certain they are a certain way. And that's not the way the world works. And we're realizing, but the tragedy is that people like Elvis and Philip K. Dick and Liberace and others, they came from what they call the silent generation. They were the children of the greatest generation. They grew up in the Depression. Their parents went to World War II and whatever. They're right before the boomers. And they had this blind side where they thought I laugh now, but again, I have to realize if I was then, I'd believe the same thing, is that street drugs were bad, but any kind of pill a doctor, prescribed to you was good because the medical community would never hurt you. And they bought into it. I mean, both Philip K. Dick tried drugs, but for the most part, eventually he turned very anti-street drug, except he would do pills. Same with Elvis. He started doing amphetamines when he was in the army in the late 50s because it gave him more energy, and all the soldiers were doing it. That's how you survive those grueling 12-hour days. And everyone was all perfectly healthy. And it started, in the 60s. Oh, I got to take these pills to work for my movies and my shows. Oh, but I need pills to go to sleep. And it began to snowball with people like Philip K. Dick and Elvis and others of that generation who somehow got caught because of their trauma, or the pressure never stopped, or their frenetic lifestyles, and then they self-destroyed eventually. So that's the interesting part. I mean, obviously today we're like, well, I don't trust street drugs or pharmaceuticals either. But unfortunately, that was a blind spot of individuals like Elvis. And you can't blame them because that's how they just thought that way.
Right. Yeah. There's another good dichotomy there between street drugs and like medical drugs and the pills and everything like that. That what I'm discovering is that, say, from a person who was nearly killed by the medical system, I was trying to avoid the medical system like the plague by doing all the natural things. So, and then that nearly killed me too. And now how I see it is totally different. I won't go super deep into it, but in the end, the conclusion is that natural health is equally as weaponized against us as medical health. Yeah. Equally or more even. Why? Because the rebels tend to reject the mainstream system, and they go for the so-called alternative, which is, just conveniently waiting there with all its poison potions as well. And then the street drugs versus medical drugs, how there's again a dichotomy, demonize one and make people run to the other. And it can work the other way around for the rebels, where they're just going to go for the street drugs and reject the, so, but one way or the other, they've got the depopulation agenda right on track.
Oh, for sure, for sure. And yeah, anything that can be weaponized will be weaponized. It's as simple as that. I mean, I have no idea, again, what the way out is. I still go back to the truckers. That's the only movement I've seen that has worked in the last 20, 30, whether, them Occupy, rebelling against the Iraq War, 90s rebellion against the world. All these movements that you and I probably marched in were completely appropriated by the powers that be. It's simple. They wrote big checks and they corrupted them. So far, the truckers are the only one I've seen that seems to be pure. So we got to tap into their essence.
Right. Not to disillusion you, but there was a great deal of appropriation of the truckers' coin.
Okay. Yeah, I'd love to hear more.
Yeah.
I don't get disappointed. I just keep looking.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, it was staggering.
Wow.
It was utterly. I think that it was an organic movement, but then it was taken over, and all of a sudden, the leaders are popping up, and then it's the money, and it's the, yeah.
Yeah, it's always that way. It's like, what happened to rock and roll? Well, when you give the Rolling Stones a Coke sponsorship, it's over. I mean, it's as simple as that. Give a check to an influencer or leader, and that's it. We're done.
Yeah, it's true. It can be that simple, unfortunately, that shallow. Yeah. Let's see, where should we go talking about Elvis? What about in his you talked about the not extracurricular, that's different, extraterrestrial encounters, and so what was happening for him at that time? How old was he when that started happening?
Let's see, he was probably late 20s, early 30s.
Okay.
Again, he always had these extra sensory abilities. But again, in the 60s, when he pivoted really to a broader form of mysticism, Yogananda, Manly P. Hall, Theosophy, whatever he could get, his astrology, numerology, and threw them all in this wonderful stew, that's when he began to tweak and find more powers to it. And that's when, his supernatural abilities, like modifying the weather, making objects move, leaving his body, he was much better at, and so many other, healing others from heart attacks to arthritis. Yeah, everybody but him. But that's when it really got going in the 60s, all the way till he died. He was still committed to his craft, to his shamanism, to his tribe, even the last day he was on Earth. But the UFOs happened in the 60s. And again, Elvis was a very well-read person. He probably read thousands of books. I think he was just a very intelligent person. But even his UFO stances were very sophisticated. In other words, we're talking in the 60s, when people thought UFOs were just like machines with little green men or whatever it was. But he speculated without ever coming to a hard stance on what UFOs could be. He thought he would read the Old Testament and Ezekiel's wheel and go, aha, extraterrestrials. But he also thought that we could be seated. He read von Daniken's The Chariots of the Gods and said maybe we were engineered by some other race. And then he thought, well, maybe the aliens are what's stopping us from destroying ourselves, and they have psychic powers, and they're trying to get the White House and the Kremlin to, chill out. Again, he didn't take a hard stance, but he loved to speculate, very much like we do today. Are they ultra-terrestrials? Are they from the sea, breakaway? So, but he had 3 experiences too. He had one in the desert, driving from Memphis to LA, where he saw these lights out, and he and his entourage believed they couldn't be experimental craft. They were moving so fast. He had the classic UFO saucer over Graceland, of all places. And it was he and Vernon and somebody else. And that's when it's interesting, because that's when Vernon, after the saucer flew over Graceland, that's when Vernon remembered the blue light when Elvis was born. It was like a memory wipe. And he goes, son, I just remember this time when you were born in this light. And he and Elvis were like, well, was I thrown down here or something? Like, are you my real dad? Whatever he thought. And then the other one was in his Bel Air mansion when this light came over the house, and he and his bodyguards were looking up, and they're like, "Oh, is that an airplane? Maybe it's a helicopter. Oh my God, it's right over the house, and it's flooding the whole area in light, and it's not making a sound." And they freaked out about it. So he had 3 definitely very certain UFO experiences. But again, he was very sophisticated. Until he had complete data, he wasn't gonna, say this or that. He was there for the experience and to speculate on it.
Right, right. Oh, yeah, fascinating. What you were saying about how his father didn't actually even really recall that experience. And I think that happens to us quite a bit. One quick example is not this year, but the last year before in Acapulco, I was sitting here preparing for it. And then it felt like a truck hit the building, and it was a sustained kind of like some shaking of things. And we don't get earthquakes here. Like we don't have that.
Mhm.
And when it was done, I just went back to my work and I completely forgot about it until we're in Acapulco and there's an earthquake. And because earthquakes happen there, and
Yeah.
things that in some cases things were actually flying off the wall, and it was pretty strong, and had some people planning a getaway plan, like how far we can run up the hill and stuff like that, and didn't make any sense. But it wasn't until then that I remembered this experience on the prairies here, where we just don't get those kind of things, that I had no context with. I didn't question, I didn't go looking for anything, I didn't try to give it a name of any kind. And then so it takes repeated experiences. So he never had any particular like encounter other than that, like just
Mm-hmm.
seeing things. He wasn't abducted or any of that kind of stuff, I'm assuming. No, yeah.
No, and nothing like that, or little green man, or face to face. Again, he used to astral travel, and he used to show people how to do it, and he could leave and travel to different skies and whatever. I remember there's one story where it's a fan, Wanda June Hill, said she was alone with Elvis, and Elvis said, "Oh, I'm from the 9th moon of Jupiter, and I'm actually from another race." And she claims that his eyes were glowing and all that, but that's the thing too. Elvis was a big joker in real life. He loved playing tricks. So I don't
Right.
know if it's true or not. He would go often and say, "People, I am not of this world. I am from somewhere else." But he could have been quoting the Gospel of John or a Hindu text. You know what I mean? It could be alien Hindu or Jesus from the Gospel of John. Just
Right, right. Oh, that's fascinating too. I'm not of this world. There was a time where it seemed like everybody in the spiritual and new age world was having this realization, I'll say in quotation marks, that, oh, I don't really belong here, and I come from the Pleiades or some other dimension. And I think it's part of how our world has been weaponized against us to make us feel like we are not of this world, that we don't belong in this world, because the cultural constructs have been created in a way that have been so unnatural and unreal that we always had to hide who we actually are. Nobody, I was a rebel child and I wanted to just be myself. Well, nobody liked that.
no.
I wasn't going along to get along, and then it didn't go well for me, all of that. So yeah, that I think there are, I'm curious to the degree that Elvis may have been manipulated in, especially as he started to grow in his fame, to again capitalize on stuff that he was already experiencing and speculating on, but to try to steer him, and knowing the influence that he had on was growing in influence, so that they could control that, how people perceived around, whether it's extraterrestrials or astral travel or all of that. Astral, not astral. Anyway,
Yeah, I
that's
think.
all speculation.
Yeah, I mean, with Elvis, it was once he got into mysticism and UFO and all that, the people around it hated it with a passion. They tried to suppress it. Priscilla didn't like it because he was becoming very detached. He wasn't physical or intimate with her. He almost quit the music industry, one to be a Christian monk and one to be a Hindu monk. And he was becoming very detached, very lofty, instead of talking about let's have a party, he wanted to have prayer circles or meditation circles. So his inner circle, Colonel Parker, Memphis Mafia, Priscilla, knew that his spirituality was a big threat. Before it was the Christian pastors, now it was Elvis Inc., the millions of dollars that he brought in every year. So there was a concerted campaign to break him away from his spiritual teachers, to tell him he has to be that's how one way you always got to Elvis is you're not being a responsible man. That was one of his Achilles heels because of the way he was raised. He was programmed in the South. So he wasn't being responsible to the people around him. So he went and said, okay, I'm done. I'm just going to be regular Elvis. But what he did is he went underground. He started hiding books in places. He would do his exercise while alone in his Vegas suite. So he went underground, and then sort of once he was divorced from Priscilla and he had more control over Parker and all that, he brought it all back more into the 70s, and you see it with his Vegas shows. I mean, there's reports where he would stop a show at Vegas and start reciting a Tibetan prayer and stuff like that. But he was very subtle about it. He never hit you over the head because he was more about sharing when it came to spirituality, not, I got to convince you. He's very confident. He knew there was a life after death. He knew there was a very divine world full of creatures, non-physical creatures, but he was fine. So I think that was Elvis. And as Summer said, I wonder if Elvis, if he had decided, I'm going to be a spiritual guru and I'm going to be this new cult leader, because he had millions of people eating out of his hands, right? Even in the 70s, extremely loyal to him. He could have started his own religion and made some stuff up, and it would have been a very big religion, if you know what I mean. But I think he chose, like Jung and others, like Jung he chose, no, I'm just going to be an entertainer. I've realized this is where my tribe needs me, as a shaman. The shaman is different than the priest and the tribe. The priest and the king control. The shaman's always on the outskirts doing his thing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Great points. Really good. I'm curious also, just before we go on, and there's a question in the chat I'm going to ask as well, that, the whole UFO thing these days, they did try to get us going along those lines. Even our own governments made some ridiculous, at least in Canada, we made some ridiculous claims that they found the aliens or whatever. I mean, to me, I couldn't even really pay attention to it. And neither did anybody else that I can tell. I felt like it was something they planned to create, an enemy, and then we have to do this, and then we have to do that, but people just didn't buy it. So do you have any comment on how it's expressing these days?
Oh God, what a mess. Yeah, obviously, I don't know what they're hiding, but I think my friend Kevin, hits it on the head. Because of science fiction and previous UFO eras, UFO is the new God. And if the government can control that narrative, I don't think they know about the reality, then eventually they can control religion, and this new religion, they can control God. So I think that's part of their plan. Right. So as for specifics, I mean, I think there's something other out there. I think I just agree with Whitley Strieber. They're visitors. We don't know. Our monkey minds cannot process what they are, but they are out there. And they do visit, whether they're fairies, UFOs, whatever you want to call them. And it's up to us to interact. But whatever the government's trying to hide, it's probably not that real. But they know that the visitors are out there. But they're more interested in the narrative, the power they can get out of it.
How they can use it, exactly. Yeah,
weaponize it, as always. Yeah,
right, exactly. Yeah, my new favorite expression is fake and gay. I say that a lot.
Exactly.
It's partly truth. Yeah. And Chandra said Elvis is a religion. I also have that feeling.
He is.
And yeah. And
imagine if he decided to make himself the Pope, but he didn't.
Right.
This Elvis religion came out organically out of him.
Right, exactly. And we'll come back to that. But is it possible Elvis was part of an agenda to simplify and bastardize music? Do you have any take on that?
No, I would say you could see that in the 60s, because again, Elvis caught everybody by surprise. I mean, completely. His story he put out a record in Memphis, and suddenly it just caught fire. And you don't have the usual forces against him. I mean, Colonel Parker, it took him a year before he signed with Elvis, and he was already a big star by himself. Colonel Parker was just able to manipulate the media and, add extra steroids to it. So I don't see that. And the pushback was so huge by the usual suspects. I mean, isn't that the point? In this day and age, it's fake and gay. If the media, the churches, the government is on your side, this was the opposite. They wanted to squash Elvis as soon as possible because it was out of hand. And I don't know if you can say simplified, because rock music was this great fusion of blues and gospel and country and all these sort of things put together, which in those days were considered, mainstream and respected music forms. Well, maybe not so much the blues, but he just threw them together, and that's what we got. So I don't think it was even simplifying. But again, he caused a stir. He had to be stopped.
Exactly. Yeah, and the blues and gospel are very simple musically. That's part of their power in a way, that so much meaning could come through, two or three chords at best. So, and fake and gay for the win. Yes, Anne, and hello, Paul. Nice to see you here. So let's talk about Elvis's decline. I don't know. We'll probably end up out of order. I'm sure there's things that we might come back to as well. But, in the context of all of that ritual, the spirituality, the knowledge of the afterlife, the ability to astral travel. How do you say it? Astral travel? Astral travel?
Astral travel, yeah.
Yeah. And then falling into an abyss in I know you already talked about how pills were like considered acceptable. So you're just always adjusting yourself for the demands that you have. And, but it seems to be kind of not a contradiction necessarily, and not an uncommon if it is a contradiction, not an uncommon one, where that can happen, where, spirituality can be increasing while physical health is declining. And sometimes people are like their most spiritual. I was told on what I thought was my deathbed, people would go like, "Oh, you're shining," and there's, this is certain people would find it extremely nourishing to be around me in those times when I didn't know if I was going to live or die. That wasn't everybody. Some people were terrified by that, but if you could step in there. So how do you see those two elements playing out with his health and spirituality?
Well, again, I tried to give different theories and ways to look at it, even from an Alcoholics Anonymous theory, from Jung, from Steiner, just so people can see, because ultimately it's a mystery. I mean, why do people sober up and all that? But at the same time, Elvis is still an enigma. For example, did you know that 2 days before he died, he was riding his Harley through Memphis? The day he died, he played hours of racquetball. Does that sound like a strung out junkie to you? He was a man of extremes. He was, and he defied logic all the time. However, I mean, his girlfriends did say he was miserable. He was in a state of deep pain at times. And on the other hand, he could take a vacation to, let's say, Hawaii for a month during Christmas break when he wasn't touring, and suddenly he was exercising and just feeling better. But as soon as he went back to being a shaman, he just would fall apart, all that. So it's hard to understand his extremes, but I would say what we talked about, he just never really took care of his trauma. I think with Jesse, he did have later conversations with his spiritual teacher, with Liberace, who also lost his twin, and he was able to work that out of what happened. But there were things, again, like the death of his mother. He was only, 22, 23 when his mother died. And then they shipped him off to West Germany in basic training. He didn't have time to heal. The divorce with Priscilla, other betrayals that he'd gone through, and just other trauma he hadn't addressed, and it just kept festering like it does with all of us, and it kept wearing him down. And again, some individuals, what do? I can't deal with my trauma, so I'm going to work extra hours. With Elvis, it wasn't just the drugs. It was just this drive to work and create art that wore him down, or I'm going to isolate myself and all that. So I think it was a combination of things that eventually caught onto him. Although, as I argue in the book, there is a good possibility that he knew when he was going to die. He predicted the day. He left hints, and his death was just a long ritualistic shaman ceremony, and he knew the day he was going to leave. So that's one of the possibilities that I put out there.
Right. That's, wow, fascinating. I can't let go of my conspiracy mind here, because I'm just thinking about the doctors prescribing all the medication. And is there a possibility that because he was having such a dramatic influence on culture, literally driving culture out of control of any controllers, that there was some collusion with the doctors to make sure he stayed on dangerous medications?
I don't know. There's a lot of stories out there. I mean, it was the 50s where he took the world by storm, and some have said that's why he had to go into the army, because he was just going to implode. I mean, remember, Elvis was always armed, and he learned martial arts early because there were always jealous husbands, boyfriends. There was always death threats throughout his career. There was blackmailing instances all the time. He rubbed shoulders with the mob, just as he rubbed shoulders with federal agents. He was always typical shaman or trickster in the liminal places. So, but in the 70s, I think he'd reached a different stature, because remember, then you had disco and punk and Kiss and David. I mean, you had far more, you might say, subversive people who actually drew from Elvis. David Bowie said his whole act was just copying Elvis. But the Clash said Elvis taught us to be punk, and the Ramones. But so I think then it didn't matter. I mean, the doctors certainly worked for Elvis, and everything was recorded. Now, there are some, of course, plenty of conspiracies. What was it, Colonel Parker? Was it the mob? I mean, there's different. Did he survive? I mean, it's a whole industry. I spend about one chapter, but there's plenty of books out there, and some of them make good arguments. I can't deny that.
Yeah, I can't imagine they would, just especially with all of the special interest groups involved, with the church and the Pope, and everybody would be like, we can't just let this guy go and rule the world and be the king, and how do we take him out? So anyway, that's just how my mind works.
Yeah, it's a possibility, but
Yeah.
who knows?
Yeah, exactly. So I know about Philip K. Dick actually from you almost exclusively. So do you want to let us know a little bit about him and why you think that Elvis and Philip K. Dick are more alike than they are different?
Yeah, that was kind of a surprise to me, and I didn't connect them until I already started the book. But basically, again, we already talked about it. Both were from the silent generation, so their idea of drugs was a little off. Both lost their twins at birth. Elvis lost Jesse. Dick lost Jane, and even Dick, survivor's guilt. When he would ask about Jane, he's like, I guess I got all the milk. Very stoic and kind of dry. But Dick admits it, like Elvis, that the main reason he wrote all these sci-fi novels and speculated on religion, and I'm sure your listeners know about them, from Blade Runner to Total Recall, Men in the High Castle, was because of Jane. That was his big drive. Just like Jesse was a huge drive for Elvis. It was his consciousness. He could hear him, just like Dick would have dreams and visions. It was all because of their lost twin, to reunite and find out why this had happened. So both were extremely driven by this. And of course, there's the dark side. Both had problems with drugs, relationships. Elvis had one divorce. I think Dick had like 5. Both certainly turned on street drugs. Elvis actually met Nixon, but Philip K. Dick was writing to Nixon saying, these drugs are killing my friends here in San Francisco and all that. Both had UFO encounters. Both had similar mystic visions. Both were very eclectic about how their spirituality, they threw stuff together and believed in reincarnation. They adopted strange Gnostic ideas, like Elvis read the Gospel of Thomas. Philip K. Dick wrote a lot about the Gnostics. So when you look at them, and of course, they both died way early. Elvis was only 42, but Dick, I think, was 52 when his body finally couldn't take that type of living, if you would. So a whole chapter connecting them, and obviously Elvis changed culture by his music and his showmanship. But Dick, of course, later on, Dick was never that famous while alive, but then his stories really influence a whole generation of people, from filmmakers to other artists to video game makers and so forth. I mean, Philip Dick's impact on modern society is huge. Some have said the Matrix, the classic movie of the late 90s, is directly inspired by Philip K. Dick. So those are some of the parallels between these two figures.
Nice. Thank you for filling that in. I bet I had a bunch of Philip K. Dick books in my house. My sister and my mom were really into science fiction, so I imagine that was among them in there. And so what was your overall message that you're hoping people are going to take away from your work on Elvis? What transformation do you hope they have?
Well, there's a few. Obviously, I want them to see this dimension about Elvis that the world has completely missed, even though it's in books, it's in biography. I mean, Priscilla writes, Elvis could cure my headaches at the touch of a hand, and saw how Elvis cured his grandmother, Minnie Mae's arthritis. So it's all there, but for some reason, maybe we weren't ready for it. Who knows? But I don't make judgments. I just know that was my sacred duty right now. But also the idea that we've talked, fate versus destiny. Do we really have free will? I mean, sometimes we look back at our lives and we're like, damn it, it was all set up for this moment, or all set up to fail. You know, we see a pattern and we wonder, how much of this was I really under control? How much of this was me or other forces? And again, I don't know. I leave it up to the reader too. And the idea of self-knowledge. I mean, the idea of Elvis certainly used to write a lot when he'd read books. Know thyself. Go inside. That's the answer to everything. So the book is about the perils and opportunities of knowing yourself or ignoring yourself. I always like Ayn Rand's quote, you can ignore reality, but you cannot ignore the consequences of ignoring reality. I've always been very good at ignoring reality, but then it always just kicks me in the face eventually. So I think those are the lessons. Obviously, drug addiction. I try to offer different paths or understandings of Elvis's addiction, and I hope people can maybe look at that. You know, if they need help, get help, because we talk about Philip K. Dick, we talk about Elvis, but sometimes you can't get around it. Like I was talking about David Bowie. David Bowie led a very destructive life, and at some point in his life he said enough, and he walked away from that and was able to stay sober and sane and healthy for the last, I don't know, 20 years of his life. So there is a way out. You don't have to self-destruct as a wounded healer. Maybe.
Yeah, that path is fascinating, of self-destruction. I'm familiar with it. Absolutely. And I think we all have our side with it, our wrestling match with it. And there's a point, you know, how they talk about you have to hit rock bottom and then you're going to make a change. And I became aware how the bottom is not a set thing. Like somebody defined the bottom for you and you're going to hit it and then things are going to change. It's that you have to decide what bottom is. And there's actually no, you know, when you always say, oh, it couldn't get any worse. Like, no, it can actually get worse. Or, you know, there couldn't be more bottom. Yeah. No, go ahead and look for that. It always can get darker.
Yeah, that's a saying I learned too in Alcoholics Anonymous. How do you know you've hit rock bottom? You stop digging. Because most of the time you're the one doing the digging. We can blame mommy, daddy, culture, you know, the gods, but you can stop digging.
That's it. Exactly. Exactly. It became the very definition of Lucifer for me. That and there maybe is a point. What do you think? Is there a point of no return where you go down so far you don't have the ability to rebound from that bottom?
No, I think there always is. If
Hmm.
anything is taught us, there is. You
Hmm.
can always turn it on turn it around. You can always turn that lead to gold. So some
Nice.
people do, some people don't.
Nice.
Again, Elvis couldn't, Philip K. Dick could, but people like David Bowie and others could, get their shit together.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Choice is always there. That's the saboteur archetype in my world,
Mhm.
that we have that. And then, so how do you relate Elvis and Gnosticism, if there's anything that hasn't come out about that yet?
Well, I talk about how he did read the Gospel of Thomas, the Nag Hammadi Library. Again, his view or discovery of a Jesus that worked for him was closer to the Gnostics, this cosmic Christ, this self-actualized guru who woke up one day and said, "That's it." And so it definitely jives more with the Gnostics and other mystic Christian groups too, and also because he was studying with Yogananda, he certainly saw the world as an illusion and just part of God's consciousness. So it goes into, the Gnostics and simulation, what's reality, what's not. He did have a vision where he encountered this being of pure evil that wanted to destroy them, just as Philip K. Dick had the same vision. So he knew there was something as ontological evil or evil spirits that were trapping us, but he also was never worried about it because he knew that calling upon Jesus would take care of it. You know what I mean? He knew there was a plan, and it was going to work out. All shall be well. So all these things certainly put him closer to the Gnostics, and he knew about the Gnostics than it would traditional Christianity.
Hmm.
And he studied Kabbalah, which is Jewish Gnosticism, for a
Hmm.
while, and other forms.
Hmm. Okay. And he studied with Yogananda, you just said?
No, its successor, Dayamata. Yogananda passed in the early 50s.
Okay.
So it was Dayamata who he studied or meditated with.
Okay. Very good. Yeah, that's very cool.
And he did
And
meet the Beatles. The Beatles and him did meet.
there you go. Yeah, I
Um,
wouldn't doubt it. I would not doubt it. Yeah. Yeah. And is there anything more that you want to say about seeing Elvis through a Jungian lens? Or did we kind of cover that earlier?
uh, no, I think it's all there.
Hmm.
Again, I offer different tweaks because, again, you can look at the wounded healer through a Jungian lens or through classic, Mircea Eliade anthropology. So it's all in the book, and the book is not a traditional bio. It's not linear.
Hmm.
It jumps around. It's stream of consciousness, and I'll be talking about Elvis and his costumes, and then go jump into shamanism and everything. But it makes sense because it all works together, and you do get Elvis's history and relationships. But it's not a traditional bio. It's more of a, I don't know, a quest inside the king's mind.
Nice. I like that. And do you think that Elvis had any inclination towards Jungianism himself?
Unfortunately, I can't find any. I wish he
Yeah.
would have. I think it could have helped him
Hmm.
because imagine if somebody needed to shadow work, it was Elvis.
Right. Right.
It would, but a spiritual teacher, I don't think spiritual teachers were brilliant, but they just didn't run into Jung. So
Hmm.
I don't see anything of that at all. It's a
Hmm.
pity because I think you're right. Bowie was into Jung, and even in the early 70s, but it took him, a couple of decades where he finally started implementing, where he's like, oh, a shadow, and and it helped him sober up, as did Alcoholics Anonymous and all that. So
Right.
it worked for Bowie once he found Jung.
Very good. Well, is there anything else, any other topics around Elvis that you'd like to get into, or do you want to let people know how to go and find your book most easily on, I believe it's Amazon, or
The usual suspects, yeah, Barnes and
yeah,
wherever, bookstores,
yeah,
it's all over the place, and
yeah.
any format you want, ebook, audiobook, it's all there. I can't think of anything. I mean, there's so many very fun tidbits and weird things. I mean, if you think he was eccentric, you'd be surprised. He was more eccentric than you can believe. Like, he used to hang out at graveyards, very shamanistic and Tibetan Buddhist thing. Meditate in a graveyard. That's what they tell you. What other habits? He loved Stanley Kubrick. One of his favorite movies was Doctor Strangelove in 2001: A Space Odyssey. He was a Trekkie. Most people don't know that. Big Trekkie. He was a proud Trekkie. So much about Elvis is just fascinating. It gives depth as a thinker, as a spiritual, or even as a geek, the stuff you like. I like some of the stories, like he could never go out in public. It just wasn't, because he'd always cause a riot. So let's say he wanted to go to the movies and watch a Stanley Kubrick film or something. He would have to rent it out at 1 a.m, the entire theater, and go there and sit there with Priscilla and his bodyguards, and just, that's how he had to watch movies. Later on, he just bought a studio in his house, and so he could see, and he would get reels. But that's how it was in the 60s and early 70s. And sometimes it didn't work because, again, talking about starting a religion, people would always find out that Elvis is somewhere, and suddenly he would get there and there'd be a throng of people outside the theater. And he was such a humble person. He always was, never forgot his roots. He would go out and said, all right, you guys, I want you fans, you can come and watch this movie for free, but just stay at the back of the theater and let me enjoy the film. And they always did those things. So he just he was a unique individual. Or another story is when he was famous, he missed being a normal guy. So at Graceland, he had this fleet of Rolls Royces and cattle, everything, but he also had this beat up truck. And he would dress himself all in black with a cap, big jar of iced tea, and he'd get in his truck. Nobody, it was the one time you couldn't follow him. And he would just drive around Memphis and hang out like the Prince. You see that with kings, and he would go to his old high school and walk around the streets. It was like his one chance to be, again, just normal, unknown Elvis, and then he'd drive back and have to go back to his life as a movie star. So a lot more there that's fascinating about the king.
Right on. Well, I'm super excited to take in the book and get that. I think it'll be a lot of fun for a summer read. And so I do encourage people to go and check out Miguel's website, starting at miguelconner.com with an ER. I never forget. Every time I spell your name, I remember the time I misspelled it. So fun. And stop digging.
I'm sure I've done your name instead of ENS, I've done INS. I'm sure that happens to you, right?
It does actually. Yeah, quite a bit. What
are you going to do?
Yeah. The last person, Topher, hosted me for a podcast, and he's like, no, it's right here in my Telegram. That's exactly how you spell it. And it's like, that's how you spelled it.
Yeah, exactly.
That's how you did it. Yeah, that's how it goes. But this has been a real pleasure and a treat for me. A nice, it's as if a light subject. We were talking earlier on how I don't get pop culture. I haven't taken it in. I've been a rebel that's kind of rejected it and turned a blind eye. And, you make references to certain elements in culture, and I just don't get it. I have to go look that up and get a little bit of background. I like taking in the culture from somebody who's synthesized it.
Right.
Like yourself, who's really spent the time, you dug in, you looked at a lot of different elements and the, like you called it, prismatic effect from all of those people's perspective. And then I am in a very short time left with a wonderful synopsis of the whole thing and a deeper relationship with Elvis as well. So thank you so much, Miguel.
Thank you very much.
There you go. Oh, that's
and fun. If you see, or any of your listeners see Elvis in your dreams or visions, let me know, because he is still making apparitions. That's why, he's part of our mythology. He's reached a almost deific level. Whether we're projecting him or I think he's still part of his essence is out there. But you go to Graceland website, they have a whole website just on Elvis apparitions. So he's still a busy person. He hasn't gone anywhere. So beware if he appears in your life. And I think that's my other argument, Beth. I think as the West disintegrates, I'm sure in Canada it's the same way. Well, now the liberals are suddenly very worried about Canadian identity. They've switched their, all of a sudden they care, when before they were trying to, atomize what it means to be a Canadian. But same in the United States, it's fragmenting. We don't know what it is to be an American. We don't know what it is culture. I think if we go back to Elvis, I think that's where the solution is, because Elvis represents American and Western culture, and for all the good, even all the bad, but that essence right there will help us get back to basics, and I think lead the way into finding an identity collectively, because I'm sure you agree, if we don't have an identity as a nation or a people or a tribe, we ain't going to go very far.
Yeah, it's true. It's a real poverty of culture going on at the level of the identification, that there can be goodness in letting identity go, but this is a different thing where it's being smashed. It's kind of like the masculine and feminine. You can grow them both, and then that creates a greater wisdom and wholeness. But if you suppress them both, that's what we're dealing with now. And then it acts out. Culture just ends up being this unconscious force that doesn't really, it's just trying to get our attention from the inside.
Yeah, that's true. And I think that's another thing. Elvis really woke women up, because there was a first time in history where women could objectify a man, where they could show passion. Remember, in the 50s, a woman expressing herself, you don't understand what the world was like, even in the West. Elvis taught women to wake up, like their kundalinis could come out, like Eve tasting the apple. And of course, if you wake up to your sexuality, the rest is going to follow. You're going to find out your mind, your body, your soul, everything's going to come, because it's these female energies. Elvis woke this up. Some of these pictures I see of women in the 50s, they're like maenads from Diana. I mean, they're just going, and I see them, they are waking up to their own power. And Elvis really helped, and he helped men too, because men didn't have to be this repressed, again, Gary Cooper kind of stoic guy. Elvis taught him, well, I can show my vulnerability. I can be softer and, work with women and everything else. So again, even with the genders, I think Elvis shows he's a solution of how we could be.
Nice. That's beautiful. Very deep. And thank you, Mara. Yeah, Elvis was forbidden fruit. Asha, I guess.
Tree of knowledge. Tree of knowledge.
Exactly. And I'm glad you're here, Mara. That's awesome. Roll those hips. There you go. Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on, Miguel. And we look forward to your next book about David Bowie, which I'll be definitely in line for. Have you on again, talk about that.
Working on that. Yeah, I'm working on that as we speak.
Okay, fantastic. All right, have a great day. I'm going to play us out with another clip from my son, who goes by the name Psycho on YouTube, and I'll share his channel. If you haven't already gone and subbed to it, that would be fun. There it is in the chat, and have a beautiful rest of your day. Miguel, I'm glad you're here.
Thanks for having me on. Okay. I enjoyed it as always. Bye.
Good. You're welcome. All right, bye for now. And I'll just let anybody know that if you haven't connected with me and my channel yet, if you like, subscribe on your way out. I did have a chance to potentially get my original YouTube channel back, but I didn't get it. And so I'm going to be connecting with Rose 777. She offered to have me on again. She was actually responsible for my first channel going over 1,000 subs some years ago, pre-pandemic, which is very cool. And why am I don't know, am I considered so dangerous, or I don't know, the bot just didn't like me that day that I was talking to. Who knows? But we'll just keep going forward as I usually do. And if you want to stay connected, then the best way to do it is to go to my website and do a King Hero archetype quiz, where in 10 minutes you can find out where on the path of purpose you are right now, where your life and the meaning of your life and the way that you're meant to serve and help people is trying to bust out of you, and what shadows you might be bumping into along the way. That once identified, then you might be able to move more quickly on that path. And I have a number of courses, coaching, and coming up in September also, I'm just right now graduating a group of Journey Code coaches, and in September, the new group will start up again. So I think that's all for today. I hope you have a beautiful rest of your day. And this is a piece by my son. All right. Bye, everyone.